Nashville, Tennessee, October 1975. The first thing Johnny Cash noticed when David Bowie walked onto the Grand Ole Opry stage was that he looked like he'd arrived from a different planet. Not metaphorically, literally. Orange hair spiked toward the ceiling, makeup sharp enough to cut glass, a jumpsuit that caught the stage lights and threw them back like a weapon. Cash was standing in the wings, dressed in his signature black, watching this alien creature command a country music audience with the kind of theatrical audacity that made Cash's hands ball into fists. Because to Johnny Cash, what he was watching wasn't music. It was a lie, a beautiful, expensive, perfectly executed lie. And Cash had spent his entire career telling the truth. But what Cash didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that David Bowie was about to tell him something that would shake everything Cash believed about authenticity, performance, and what it meant to be real. And it would almost end in violence. The Grand Ole Opry had invited Bowie as part of a new sound series, an attempt to seem relevant, to bridge the gap between country tradition and whatever the hell was happening in the rest of music in 1975. Cash had been booked as the headliner, the man in black, the voice of prisoners, outlaws, and broken people, the most authentic artist in American music. And then there was Bowie, performing 3 songs before Cash's set, turning the Opry stage into a glam rock fever dream. Cash stood backstage and watched, his face carved from stone. Bowie wasn't singing. He was performing, every gesture calculated, every note placed with surgical precision. The whole thing felt rehearsed, manufactured, packaged for consumption. "That's not music," Cash muttered to his guitar player. "That's a fucking circus." His guitar player said nothing because everyone knew when Johnny Cash was angry, you stayed quiet. When Bowie finished his final song, some theatrical piece about space and alienation, the crowd erupted. Not the traditional Opry audience response of polite appreciation, but genuine excitement. Young people screaming, old people confused but impressed. Bowie bowed, elaborate and precise, and walked off stage directly past Johnny Cash. Their eyes met. Cash saw performance, artifice, everything he'd spent his life standing against. Bowie saw judgment, rigidity, everything he'd spent his life escaping. Neither looked away. "Mr. Cash," Bowie said, extending a hand. Cash didn't take it. "Son," Cash said, his voice low and dangerous, "that wasn't real music." And that's where everything started to go wrong. The green room after the show was tense with unspoken conflict. Cash was sitting in a folding chair, tuning his guitar, radiating controlled fury. Bowie was touching up his makeup in the mirror, aware that Cash was watching him with something close to contempt. Finally, Cash spoke. "You gonna tell me what that was out there?" Bowie set down his makeup brush. "I thought it was fairly obvious. A performance." "That's the problem," Cash said. "It's all performance with you people. No truth, no pain, just costumes and theatrics." "Define real," Bowie said calmly, turning to face him. Cash stood up. He was taller than Bowie, broader, carrying the weight of a man who'd actually lived the stories he sang about. Prison concerts, addiction, redemption earned through suffering. "Real is pain," Cash said. "Real is truth. Real is blood. It's singing about things you've actually lived, not characters you're pretending to be." Bowie smiled, not mockingly, but with genuine curiosity. "And you're not performing that?" The question hung in the air like smoke. But this is where everything went wrong. Cash's face darkened. "What the hell does that mean?" "It means," Bowie said carefully, "that you're on that stage selling your suffering just like I'm selling my personas. You're performing authenticity. I'm performing theatricality. But we're both performing." "I lived it," Cash said, his voice rising. "I was in prison. I was an addict. I crawled through hell and came out the other side. Those aren't characters. That's my life." "And now you package that life and sell it to audiences," Bowie said. "You wear the same black outfit every show. You do the same between-song patter. You've perfected the performance of being Johnny Cash, the authentic outlaw. That's still a performance. Cash took a step closer. You don't know a goddamn thing about what I've been through. You're right, Bowie said, but I'm not claiming to. I'm honest about the fact that I'm playing characters. You're pretending your performance isn't a performance because it's based on real events. But the moment you walk on that stage, you're performing just like I am. The only difference is I admit it. The room went silent except for the sound of Cash's breathing, heavy and controlled. You think you're clever, Cash said quietly. You think you figured something out, but you're just a coward hiding behind makeup and costumes because you're too afraid to show people who you really are. Bowie felt the words land like punches, because part of him wondered if Cash was right. And you, Bowie said, his voice harder now, are so committed to your image of authenticity that you've turned your suffering into a brand. You're as trapped in your persona as I am in mine. The only difference is you think yours is more noble. What Cash was hiding was far worse. Cash's hands were shaking, not from fear, from rage, because Bowie had touched something Cash didn't want to examine. The question Cash had spent years avoiding. How much of Johnny Cash was performance? How much of the Man in Black was a carefully constructed identity designed to give audiences what they wanted? Authenticity, redemption, the outlaw made good. Cash had been performing for so long that he couldn't separate the man from the myth anymore, and Bowie had just pointed that out. You know what your problem is? Cash said, his voice low and dangerous. You don't believe in anything. You're just surfaces, just masks. You change who you are every 2 years because you're too afraid to commit to being anything. And your problem, Bowie shot back, is that you committed too early. You found one version of yourself that worked, and you've been trapped in it ever since. You can't change because your entire identity is built on being the real Johnny Cash. But that's just another cage. They were inches apart now. Two men who'd spent their lives constructing identities, one through suffering made public, one through personas made explicit, and both of them wondering in that moment if the other was right. Cash's guitar player stepped between them. Johnny, you're on in 5 minutes. Cash didn't move. His eyes were locked on Bowie, and for a moment, everyone in the room thought he was going to throw a punch. You're fake, Cash said quietly. Everything about you is fake, and one day you're going to wake up and realize you became so many people that you stopped being anyone. And you're trapped, Bowie said just as quietly. You're trapped in a performance of authenticity that you can never escape because your audience needs you to be real. You're as much a prisoner as the men you sang to at Folsom. Cash's jaw clenched, then he turned and walked out. His guitar player looked at Bowie. You shouldn't have said that. Bowie sat down, his hands shaking slightly. No, I probably shouldn't have. Cash walked onto the Grand Ole Opry stage 5 minutes later. The crowd erupted. The Man in Black. The legend. He stood at the microphone for a long moment, not speaking, just breathing. Then he launched into Folsom Prison blues. And something was different. He sang it harder than usual, angrier, like he was trying to prove something, like he was fighting an invisible opponent. In the wings, Bowie watched, transfixed, because he could see it now. Cash wasn't just singing, he was performing authenticity. Every gravelly note, every pause, every bit of between-song patter about his past. It was all constructed, perfected over decades. A character called Johnny Cash that the real man inside had to inhabit every time he stepped on stage. And the real man, whoever that was, had disappeared somewhere along the way. Just like Bowie's real self had disappeared into Ziggy, the Duke, all the others. They were the same, just using different methods. After the show, someone tried to get Cash and Bowie together for a photo. No, Cash said flatly. I don't take pictures with liars. Bowie heard about it later and smiled sadly. He's not wrong. I am a liar. I just lie about different things than he does. They never spoke again, never collaborated, never reconciled. For the rest of their lives, when asked about each other in interviews, Both would give polite, distant answers. Talented man, different approach. Interesting artist, not for me. But people who knew them both said the same thing. The conversation haunted them. 1990s. 20 years later, Johnny Cash was recording his American Recordings albums, stripped down, raw, confronting his mortality. In interviews, he talked about authenticity, about staying true to yourself, about the importance of real emotion in music. But sometimes, late at night, he'd think about what Bowie had said. You're performing authenticity. That's still a mask. And he'd wonder. Meanwhile, Bowie was in his experimental phase, deliberately avoiding anything that looked like a fixed identity. In interviews, he talked about transformation, about the impossibility of a true self, about performance as honesty. But sometimes, late at night, he'd think about what Cash had said. You're too afraid to show people who you really are. And he'd wonder, Divi tukstoshi tris. Johnny Cash died in September at 71 years old. When Bowie heard the news, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said to Iman, he was right, about me being afraid. I've spent my whole life hiding. He had the courage to stay visible as himself. Iman was quiet for a moment. Then, he was performing too, wasn't he? Yes, Bowie said, but he believed in his performance. That made it real in a way mine never was. Divi tukstoshi seshpatsmitais. David Bowie died in January, at 69 years old. Someone asked one of Cash's former bandmates what Johnny would have thought. The bandmate was quiet for a long time. Johnny respected him, he said finally. Never admitted it, but he did. Because Bowie was honest about the performance. And Johnny spent his whole life trying to convince people he wasn't performing. But he was. They both were. Here's the question neither of them could answer. What's more real? Suffering that's packaged and sold, or fiction that's honestly labeled? Cash thought authenticity came from lived experience. Bowie thought authenticity came from honesty about artifice. And the truth is, they were both right. And both wrong. Because in the end, every artist is performing. The only question is whether you admit it. Cash built his career on the illusion of complete honesty. Confessional, raw, unfiltered, but it was still constructed, still designed, still a performance of authenticity for an audience that needed to believe it was real. Bowie built his career on the explicit acknowledgement of performance, characters, personas, masks, but underneath all of them was still a human being choosing which lies to tell, which was its own kind of honesty. Neither method was more real. They were just different strategies for dealing with the same problem. How do you give people something true when the act of performing makes everything false? Cash's answer: perform truth so well that it becomes real. Bowie's answer: perform fiction so honestly that it becomes true. And the tragedy is that they almost understood each other. In that green room in 1975, for just a moment, they both saw it. The mirror they held up to each other. Cash saw what he'd become, a performance of authenticity so convincing he'd forgotten it was a performance. Bowie saw what he was afraid of becoming, so many performances that the performer disappeared. And instead of recognizing each other as fellow travelers on the same impossible journey, they fought and walked away and spent the rest of their lives wondering if the other had been right. There's no footage of that backstage confrontation, no recording of what they said to each other. Just secondhand stories, half remembered by people who were there. But both men carried it with them. Cash, every time he walked on stage in his black clothes, and wondered if he was still the man who'd worn them first, or just an actor playing a role. Bowie, every time he created a new persona and wondered if transformation was freedom, or just fear with better marketing. They never got their answer. Because the question doesn't have one. Is performed authenticity less real than acknowledged fiction? Is suffering sold on stage less honest than characters explicitly labeled as false? There's no right answer. Just two men, two methods, two ways of surviving the impossible task of being an artist in public. Cash survived by never changing, Bowie survived by never staying still. And when they met, when those two philosophies collided in a green room in Nashville in 1975, neither could save the other. Because you can't save someone from a choice they've already made. Cash chose to be real. Bowie chose to be honest about being fake. And both choices were performances. And both performances were real. And neither of them could accept that about the other. So they fought and parted and died, still wondering, still performing, still trapped in the beautiful, terrible paradox of being an artist. The only way to be authentic is to perform. And the only way to perform honestly is to admit it's not authentic. Cash and Bowie, the outlaw and the alien, the truth teller and the liar, both telling the same truth in different languages that neither could translate.